By 1966, Brian Wilson had released Pet Sounds. Both innovative and revolutionary, it showcased the sophisticated, mature Beach Boys, but commercially, it hadn't achieved the numbers of their straightforward surf rock. With the criticism Brian faced from both his band and his record company, he began to decline. Still, he hadn't dried up creatively and fought to bring his musical vision from his head onto record, but the Smile sessions became increasingly weird. A number of factors would see Brian abandon the album. These are as follows: resistance from some of the other Beach Boys, specifically Mike Love, resistance from Capitol Records, who worried the experimental sound wouldn't be commercial, and finally, Brian was now struggling to arrange and structure his songs. His drug use was at an all-time high. This was mainly because of the pressure he was under. He began dreading the recording sessions, so would turn up high to relieve his anxiety. This only flamed the fire. In a drugged state, he once instructed the other Beach Boys to grunt around the floor of Western studios imitating pigs for the recording of Heroes and Villains. Al Jardine, who was the only sober person in the room, remembered, "It was like being in a lunatic asylum." It was a crucial point in the turbulent career of Brian Wilson. Music had always been his solution to his problems in life. In a world of disorder, Brian had found order as a songwriter, but now his escape had become his battleground. It was now Brian's life would completely fall apart, and for the Beach Boys collectively, it began the next wave in the band's saga. With their leader in turmoil, the other 5 Beach Boys would step forward to write, arrange and produce. Not to say that Brian was totally absent, he continued writing songs and producing albums, but from a distance. Due to his instability, Brian was relieved of his authority. The rest of the group would now have equal say in the creative process, and their name would be credited on each album. As he always did, Brian went along with it. The rest of the group would now see how difficult Brian's job was. This year would begin a strange turn for the Beach Boys. The songs on Smile would appear throughout their albums for the next 4 years. It was the end of an era for Brian Wilson and the beginning of a new phase for the Beach Boys.
It's way too much time.
15.
Take what?
1-5.
Okay, this is take 15, all right?
Near the beginning of 1967, the Beach Boys had filed a lawsuit against their label Capitol Records. They were suing them over $225,000 royalties they were owed. They'd also started their own record company, Brother Records, and were intent on releasing their next album through that company. To settle their disputes, Capitol and the Beach Boys came to an agreement. Capitol agreed to pay the outstanding royalties and distribute albums for Brother Records. In April, the Beach Boys, minus Brian, went on their European tour starting with Dublin. Ever since they could remember, their European tours had been a big success, but not this time. Firstly, they were forbidden by the British Musicians Union to use 4 extra musicians for their live shows. This meant they were unable to recreate the complex Pet Sounds material effectively. At the same time, their record company, who were impatient the group hadn't released a new single, almost a year now, released an old cover song they recorded in 1965. It was a Phil Spector tune titled "Then He Kissed Me." The Beach Boys had retitled the song "Then I Kissed Her." It was a fine example of the group pulled backwards while they were trying to move forwards. When their tour reached Birmingham, England, they found out Brian would be scrapping their next album, Smile, the long-awaited masterpiece. When they returned home just 2 weeks later, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Complex production and incredible compositions featured. It blew away critics and fans alike. It outshined Pet Sounds and established the Beatles as the #1 group in the world. It was at this time the Beach Boys were due to perform at the Monterey Pop Festival, a big event for the counterculture organised by Papa John Phillips, Lou Adler and a few others. But the Beach Boys weren't feeling it. Brian especially had little interest. As it happens, their PA system had already been coached over. It was used by other musicians during the festival. It was at this point Brian decided out of the blue the Beach Boys' next single needed to be released. The song he'd worked on during the Smile sessions. The song, Brian felt, was a worthy follow-up to Good Vibrations. Brian decided the track, Heroes and Villains, must be released immediately. The problem was, it was past midnight and he was sat in his living room. Brian phoned Terry Melcher and a few other executives at Capitol and insisted Heroes and Villains be released right now. They set out to Brian's house. Then they drove to a local radio station. When they arrived, Brian presented the radio DJ with the Beach Boys song to play live on the radio, but the man refused, saying it wasn't on the playlist. Terry Melcher pulled the man aside and insisted to speak to his manager. When the man came to the phone after being woken up, Melcher instructed him, tell the DJ to put the fucking record on right now, to which of course he did. The single, when released, did fairly well, reaching number 12, but nothing compared to what Brian envisioned as the long-awaited follow-up to Good Vibrations. In short, it was another crushing blow. The Smile album now abandoned, the group set about recording a more simplified version. Smiley Smile would begin in June. The album would be the first in a trilogy of lo-fi Beach Boys records. Recording for Smiley Smile would begin in a makeshift studio in Brian Wilson's new living room and den, which was located behind a hidden bookcase. Brian at this point was no longer interested in leaving his home to record a record. The album contained a bunch of Smile tracks, albeit more primitive for the album, and a new composition written by Brian and Mike. The group, funny enough, now had more creative control than ever before, but at this point in their career, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. The sophisticated productions Brian was known for were gone. The tracks were mainly built around Brian playing an organ. Mike Love later wrote, "Some of the songs we recorded could barely be called songs." Side note, Brian had recently moved from his previous home in Laurel Way, now insisting he needed a bigger house. Before he and his wife Marilyn moved in, construction workers were hired to clear out tons of sand from Brian's previous home in order to sell the mansion. The infamous Arabian tent was also dismantled. The couple moved into Bellagio Road in Bel Air without even looking upstairs. When they viewed the property, there was something going on and the real estate agents wouldn't take the couple up. Marilyn protested, "I can't buy a house if I can't see my bedrooms," but Brian insisted everything would be fine, and so they bought the house. Capitol Records sent over 25-year-old sound engineer Steve Desper to remix, edit, and organise the project. He remembered setting up the makeshift studio in the Bel Air house. The mixing would be very basic, no double tracking or echo was used on the vocals. Instead, they would record the Beach Boys singing in either the bathroom or Brian's empty pool. The pool had been drained for repairs, so they decided to make use of it using the natural echo. The whole recording process was a far cry from the perfectionism Brian was known for. The album contained audible mistakes and false starts. As recording went on, Brian encouraged the others to smoke marijuana, in which they did. While going through takes, Brian got it into his head the group would sing much better if they looked happy, so he encouraged them to smile while singing. Other than that, Brian had little interest. He was no longer the sole authority, so he would disappear on drug binges that lasted days. He also spent a lot of time in his bedroom. Ultimately, he turned up for sessions as and when he felt like it. They went through the recording sessions in Brian's living room, laying down more and more tracks lifted from Smile, but in a slapdash, half-hearted attempt. The band can even be heard whispering during some takes. It's not certain exactly how long it took, but Brian at the time stated it took 4 weeks to record, while Carl Wilson later remembered the album taking just 2 weeks. The mixing was complete in one long overnight session. Capitol Records designed the cover, as they always did with Beach Boys records. Very fitting, whether intentional or not, it depicted a small cottage amongst an overgrown forest. The greenery high up into the sky looks to be slowly engulfing the house. It was like a nod to Brian slowly losing control. No other Beach Boys album in history had been so anticipated. It was released in the summer of 1967 and became the worst-selling album of the Beach Boys' history, peaking at a shocking 41 in the charts. The long-awaited project had disappointed fans and critics alike. Dennis Wilson around this time split from his wife Carol. He'd first filed for divorce proceedings a year previous, but relented when the two reconciled. Now, Carolyn had filed for divorce. The two would battle over property settlements for the rest of Dennis's life. Immediately after the release of Smiley Smile, the group wanted to move quickly past the disappointment. They were eager to prove themselves as a serious band. They now reinvented themselves as a rock group. The group began recording their next album again at Brian's home, this time distancing themselves from psychedelic rock. They were attempting to evolve their sound, but at the same time, they had no interest in commenting on the social issues of the times like so many of their contemporaries had chosen to do. Carl Wilson now stepped forward and contributed significantly to the recording and producing process. Brian at this point was happy to hand the reins over. The cover art for Wild Honey featured a stained glass window. The design had been taken from a window in Brian's Bel Air home that the group looked at every day when they recorded in the studio. When released, the album fared slightly better than Smiley Smile in the charts, reaching 24. But compared with all other previous albums, which easily made the top 10 position, it was a failure. Carl Wilson brushed off the bad sales of Wild Honey, stating it was just music for Brian to call out to. At the same time, Brian had a refrigerator installed in his bedroom. He rarely came downstairs now, though sometimes he even felt bad vibrations in his bedroom and slept in one of the other rooms. This was a pattern he'd continued for many years. At this time, Mike Love too moved to Bel Air. He bought a house at 1215 Coldwater Canyon. With Dennis's marriage over, he too moved out of his home and into a hunting lodge at 14400 Sunset Boulevard. It was filled with oak furniture and had a swimming pool the shape of California. It was the same home the Manson family would soon occupy. At this time, Murray Wilson released his first and only album, The Many Moods of Murray Wilson. It featured no vocals and Murray didn't play any instruments. He acted as the producer and composer of some of the songs. As 1967 comes to an end, after a concert in Paris, Dennis strikes up a conversation with the notorious Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The mystic man taught him about transcendental meditation, and it was not long before the Beach Boys were involved. Like the Beatles, the Beach Boys took heavily to TM. In January of 1968, Brian gave an interview in his home with an independent journalist. In the interview, he discusses his interest in writing songs about meditation. At this point, with the next album in mind, engineer Stephen Desper upgrades Brian's portable home studio into a fully professional setup with the capabilities of any other. A month later, Mike travels to Rishikesh, where the Beatles, Donovan and Mia Farrow are there. Mike reportedly had taken a suitcase of batteries, film and other items with the intention of selling them to others staying there. Paul McCartney remembered him being like a dealer. Despite the allegations of sexual misconduct to the Maharishi, Mike stayed a firm supporter of the Holy Man and TM. While Mike was away, the group began recording their next album, Friends. Again, the album was recorded in Brian's Bel Air home studio. The entire thing was written there in Brian's living room as the light shone through the Wild Honey stained glass window. It was the first album in which Brian wasn't the primary composer. Dennis came into his own as a songwriter at this point and surprised the others with his abilities. In fact, other than the title track, Dennis's contributions were the best on the album. As recording begins, session musicians are brought in. The album, as Brian stated, was heavily influenced by the practice of transcendental meditation. At this point, the Beach Boys were still trying to find their sound, while their record company Capitol were marketing them as the #1 surf group in the world. It couldn't be more out of touch with what was happening at the time. On one of the days he wasn't recording, Dennis picked up 2 female hitchhikers. He brought them back to his house in Sunset Boulevard. They stayed the night and Dennis attended a recording session for Friends the next day. When he returned home at early 3 a.m, the house was lit up and he could hear what sounded like a party of people inside. As he stepped out of his car, the front door opened and he was greeted by a small man with dark brown hair. Dennis was in a state of shock and confused and found himself asking, "Are you going to hurt me?" The man's expression dropped. He looked wounded. It was not the impression he'd imagined he was giving off in his head. The man replied, "Do I look like I'm gonna hurt you, brother?" Then kneeled down and kissed the shoes Dennis was wearing. When Dennis inquired who the man was, he stated, a friend. The friend in question, as you already guessed, was Charles Manson. Dennis was an obvious target for Manson. He was wealthy, he had ties to the music industry, and above all, he was generous to a T. When Mike returned from Rishikesh, he joined the band recording Friends. Cover art was the first Beach Boys album to feature Bruce Johnston. When the album was released, it broke the record for their worst selling album, charting at a jaw-dropping 126 in the charts. Carl had stated Wild Honey was written as music for Brian to cool out to, but Brian actually cited Friends as the album that was most relaxing. Meanwhile, Dennis had an interest in his new friend Charles Manson's music. Manson needed somewhere to record his songs, and Dennis arranged for him to be scheduled in at Brian's home recording studio. Stephen Desper was the engineer on the recording sessions. The plan was for Manson to record some songs that could be shown to major record labels. On the day, Manson showed up completely unprepared. He turned up with several girls who smoked dope in the studio. Brian was upstairs the whole time and never emerged. Manson had only one request. He could alter the sound in any way, but don't change the lyrics. As they began recording songs, Desper remembered them being quite good. He returned several times and recorded about 8 tracks in total. As the sessions went on, Manson's true self began to emerge. Desper found him an intimidating character. Manson once pulled out a knife, according to him, to clean the dirt from his fingernails. He also waved it around when talking and began staring at Desper with a crazy look. The engineer complained to others at Capitol Manson was unpredictable and psychotic. He also smelled very bad. Brian's wife Marilyn didn't like Manson either, or the girls who came to the house. She once disinfected the toilet after they'd left. Further sessions for Manson were called off. They reasoned 8 songs was enough anyway, and so Manson thought nothing of it and went his way. It's been said Brian and Carl produced these songs, but as of the time of this documentary, they have never seen the light of day. At this time, Manson and the girls were living at Dennis's log cabin permanently. Manson ordered the girls to cut up Dennis's clothes and sew them back together as robes everyone could wear. Dennis, according to his ex-wife Carol, was in a constant drug stupor during this period. Massive failure of Friends, the group desperately needed a hit single. For the first time since 1965, they recorded a surf song. Do It Again was released just 2 weeks after the release of Friends and hit number 1 in the UK charts. They soon began on their next album, 2020. 2020 was named so as it was the 20th album the band had released. Again, recording at Brian's home, but this time there was a change. The material was made up mainly of singles, B-sides, and of course, Smile leftovers. It would be the band's last album for Capitol Records. Brian was dead against the inclusion of the Smile songs Cabin Essence and Our Prayer. He refused to record new vocals. He even left the house when the band were working on them. Though Brian was not present for a lot of the recording sessions, he had admitted himself to a psychiatric unit. His involvement in 2020 was almost non-existent. Dennis, and especially Carl, stepped forward with the production. Dennis bought a composition of Manson's songs for the Beach Boys to record. He especially liked the song Cease to Exist. Dennis rearranged the song though and changed the lyrics from Cease to Exist to Cease to Resist, and then changed the title to Never Learn Not to Love. The album cover was the first to see the band without Brian. Possibly, this was a message the Beach Boys were putting out about his lack of involvement. The album was released on February of 1969. It fared better than Friends, reaching 68 on the US Billboard charts. But it was a great disappointment to the band. Dennis Wilson later stated, 2020 was the only letdown of the Beach Boys' career that embarrassed me through and through. It was the first album the group made that was completely disjointed. A month previous, recording sessions had begun on the group's next album. At this point, they were in dire straits. They had no record label and they were running out of money. Brother Records had blown through their income. This time, Beach Boys accountants noticed unexplained payments ran up on Dennis's credit card. On further inspection, this was due to Manson. Someone at Brother Records then looked into Manson's background and discovered his criminal past. The family had slowly sold all of Dennis's belongings, musical equipment, gold records, cars. Around 100,000 he'd lost. It was now a penny drop for Dennis. As the house was rented and not paid for, Dennis simply let the lease run out. Manson returned to Spawn Ranch with no apparent hard feelings. He still needed Dennis to further his musical career. Murray Wilson, who was facing cash troubles, contacted Brian and suggested they write a song together. In a throwback to the Beach Boys' old surf sound, the song Breakaway was written. Despite being just as great as any of their early surf music, it flopped. This didn't escape the attention of potential record labels who now saw the Beach Boys as a risky investment. It would be Reprise who would sign the Beach Boys, but they insisted they meet Brian first. Rumour was going round he had completely lost his mind. The record company wanted to see for themselves. A meeting was scheduled at Brian's home where he was to show them the latest songs the Beach Boys had been working on. When they arrived, Brian had painted his face green. He acted completely normal, as if nothing was wrong. No one actually said anything. And after they left, Brian commented he just wanted to see how they reacted. In May, Dennis did an interview and he mentioned his friend Charles Manson. He cites him as a musician and poet who might be on Brother Records. He also states, "Sometimes the wizard scares me." It was around this time, according to Mike Love, Dennis visited Spawn Ranch and witnessed Manson shoot a man with an M16 machine gun. He was too scared to go to the police and hoped Manson and his family would disappear if he distanced himself from them. If you're to go by Mike Love's story, this would have been the exact catalyst for Dennis ending his relationship with the Manson family. Dennis had also previously introduced Manson to a record producer named Terry Melcher. He was a much sought after figure in the industry, and many groups would be lucky to have him produce their songs. Manson was no exception. Dennis now began distancing himself from Manson and his followers, and it became obvious to Manson the record deal with Brother Records would not be happening. Manson now honed in on Melcher. This, he saw, being his last chance to become the famous rock star he dreamed he should be. Terry Melcher visited Spawn Ranch on a few occasions over the spring of 1969. An incident where Manson beat up a ranch hand left Melcher unsettled. And besides, Melcher wasn't overly impressed with Manson's songs. He stopped taking Manson's calls. Manson was now in a fit of rage. He felt all his dreams had been destroyed, and so he would take revenge against the society that had rejected him. Some of the murders that would take place occurred at Terry Melcher's former home. His mother Doris Day had heard of the stories of Manson waving a knife around, and she insisted Terry move out, possibly mother's intuition. Melcher would go on to testify at the Manson trial. Dennis couldn't bring himself to. Melcher was haunted by the murders for the rest of his life. Though the music industry had lost faith in the Beach Boys hadn't lost faith in themselves. This next album, they truly believed would bring them back to their glory days. The songs were strong. Dennis had wrote a ballad that was by far his best. Brian committed himself to the album. Not to say his perfectionism that was ever present in the early work was back. It wasn't. It never would be. But he was taking this project seriously. The album showcased the return of Brian's intricate vocal harmonies, balanced with lush instrumentation. He went over tracks, spending hours fine-tuning each part. With a new record label, an album that was better than anything they'd written in years, the failures of the last 4 albums didn't seem to affect them. The music coming from Brian's home studio gave them more and more confidence they would again rise back to their former glory. They gave a finished master of Sunflower to reprise. But the record company, though impressed with the majority of tracks, had an issue with a few songs. They felt they weren't up to scratch, and so they rejected the album. The Beach Boys were furious, but still, they went back and changed the songs. When the group resubmitted the album, Reprise were pleased and excited. They anticipated such high numbers and sales that they convinced retailers to stock more albums in their shops than they had of any other sold album. The Beach Boys were also confident. They expected big numbers, similar to their surf rock days. Brian Wilson was a little more skeptical. He knew it wasn't up to his previous work. He stated at the time, "It doesn't please me as much as I wish, but the record should do very well." The album bombed worse than any other Beach Boys record in existence. They had again broke their own record for the worst charting position. An unbelievable 151 in the top 200 US Billboard. In the UK, 29, a dramatic fall. The problem was, the failure of their previous albums had destroyed their reputation. Radio DJs refused to play their latest single. The failure of Sunflower was a terrible blow, especially to Brian. It was something that took years to get over. Not till the mid-70s would he step back into the production seat. The second half of the 60s had been like a tidal wave for the Beach Boys. Without warning, they'd been knocked from their heights, left without their leader, and forced to reinvent their style. With the failure of Sunflower, the band even contemplated splitting up. They'd give it their all, the best they could do, and the album bombed worse than anything previously released. In truth, the world in 1969 had changed so much. The Beach Boys didn't fit in. Their music was so passé, so out of touch. In fact, if they'd first formed a band during that period, it's unlikely they would have succeeded. Frustration and outrage filled the air as the 1960s turned into the 1970s. Dreamy optimism the Beach Boys sang so passionately about was a thing of the past. This isn't to say it wouldn't be possible for anyone to succeed at this period singing psychedelic rock, but it would take a genius to captivate an audience with the style of music they were writing. They had one in the band, but he was no longer capable of such a demanding task. If they hit rock bottom entering the 1970s, before it would get any better for the Beach Boys, things were going to get a lot worse. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.